The year 41 since the Nativity of Christ, Rome, the Palatine Hill, the heart of the vast empire. The air on this January day was damp and cold, but in the narrow vaulted corridors beneath the imperial palace, a different atmosphere reigned, a stifling, electrified mixture of fear, sweat, and suppressed anticipation. Here, in the gloom of the cryptoporticus, the so-called underground passage that connected the palace complexes, history paused for one short, terrible moment. Emperor Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to the whole world by his childhood nickname Caligula, was returning from the Palatine Games. He was in a good mood, surrounded by a retinue of senators and young aristocrats who were singing his praises. He had lingered to speak with some actors, and it was at this moment that a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, Cassius Chaerea, stepped out from the shadows. A man whom the emperor had publicly humiliated for years, making lewd jokes about his thin, effeminate voice. Chaerea approached and, as protocol required, asked the princeps for the password for the day. Caligula, smirking, threw back another obscene word in response. It was the last joke of his life. "Hoc age," which means "do it now," shouted Chaerea, and his sword, flashing in the dim torchlight, struck the first blow, slashing the emperor's neck and shoulder. Caligula, in disbelief, staggering, tried to flee, crying out that he was still alive. But it was too late. The other conspirators, Praetorians and senators, like a pack of wolves, fell upon him. Cornelius Sabinus struck him in the chest, then another blow, and another. 30 blades plunged into the body of the man who, a moment before, had considered himself a living god. They struck him with an insane fury, even when he was already dead, venting all their accumulated terror, all their hatred and disgust. When it was over, in the ringing silence of the undercroft, what was left of the third Roman emperor lay on the marble floor. His murderers scattered, leaving Rome in chaos and without a leader. On that day, it was not just one man's life that was cut short. On that day, the myth of the divine ruler collapsed, and a terrible truth was laid bare. Power in Rome was not the will of the gods or the decision of the Senate, but merely the sharpness of a blade and the resolve of the one willing to wield it. How did it come to this? How did the boy whom the legions adored, whose accession to the throne was met with universal jubilation, the hope of the entire empire, turn into a monster whose death was celebrated with the same ecstasy? To understand the tragedy of Caligula, we must return to the very beginning, to the world that created him. A world of intrigue, betrayal, and boundless power forged in the fires of civil wars and sealed with the blood of the Julio-Claudian Dynasty. For before the monster appeared, there was a boy, and before the boy, there was an empire built on the bones of the Republic. To fully comprehend the phenomenon of Caligula, it is necessary to immerse oneself in the very essence of the political system he inherited. The Roman Empire of his youth was still a very young entity, draped in the old worn toga of the Republic. The man who created this system, Octavian Augustus, was a genius of political camouflage. After decades of bloody civil wars that had destroyed the old aristocracy, he understood that Rome would never accept an open monarchy. The word rex, or king, was steeped in hatred since the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud. Therefore, Augustus created something different, the Principate. On paper, in words, he was merely the first among equals, the Princeps Senatus. He restored the Senate, brought back the election of magistrates, and preserved all republican institutions. But this was merely a facade, a grand and masterful decoration. In reality, all power was concentrated in his hands. He controlled the army, being the supreme commander. He governed the richest and most strategically important provinces, including Egypt, the breadbasket of Rome. He possessed the power of a people's tribune, which made his person sacred and inviolable and gave him the right to veto any decision of the Senate. He was the chief priest, the Pontifex Maximus, controlling the entire religious life of the state. Augustus was, in essence, an absolute monarch who wisely chose not to call himself one. He ruled for more than 40 years, bringing Rome a long-awaited peace and stability, the so-called Pax Romana. He built temples, roads, and aqueducts, transforming Rome from a city of brick into a city of marble. He was a patron of the arts, a supporter of Virgil and Horace. This system was held together by a delicate balance and an unspoken social contract. The senatorial aristocracy, having lost real power, retained its wealth, prestige, and the illusion of participation in governance. The equestrian order, the regime's pillar, gained access to important administrative and financial posts. The urban plebs in Rome were pacified with free grain distributions and grandiose spectacles, and the provinces, exhausted by the plundering of republican governors, breathed a sigh of relief under a more just and orderly imperial administration. It was a complex, multi-layered structure held together by authority, gold, and legions. But this system had one congenital, fatal vulnerability: the problem of succession. If you are not a king, how do you transfer power? Augustus, obsessed with the idea of creating a dynasty, spent his entire life searching for a successor. One by one, death took away his chosen ones: his nephew Marcellus, his faithful comrade Agrippa, his grandsons Gaius and Lucius Caesar. Fate seemed to mock him. In the end, at the end of his life, he was left with only one candidate, whom he openly disliked and disrespected: his stepson, Tiberius Claudius Nero. And it is here, at this transition of power, that the system first cracked. Tiberius was the complete opposite of Augustus. If Augustus was a master of public politics, charming and charismatic, then Tiberius was a withdrawn, gloomy, and suspicious aristocrat of the old school. His bitterness also had deep personal roots. On Augustus's orders, he had to divorce his beloved first wife, Vipsenia Agrippina, and marry the emperor's promiscuous daughter, Julia, which he took as a terrible humiliation. He was a brilliant general, one of the best in Roman history, and a decent administrator, but he despised flattery, palace intrigues, and the very hypocritical game of a restored republic that Augustus played so masterfully. He accepted power reluctantly at the age of 55, already a tired and disillusioned man. He saw the Senate not as partners, but as a collection of men ready for slavery, as he once remarked upon leaving the Curia. It was during Tiberius's reign that the foundation of fear and paranoia was laid, upon which Caligula's tyranny would later grow. The Senate, deprived of real power but retaining its immense vanity, quickly sensed the change. Tiberius did not fawn over them as Augustus had. He spoke to them directly, sometimes even rudely. The senators, accustomed to veiled commands, did not understand him and were afraid. This mutual fear and misunderstanding gave birth to a monster, the law of majestas, or offense against majesty. Originally intended to protect the state from treason, under Tiberius it became a tool for settling scores and political repression. Any careless word, any criticism of the emperor, or even a poorly thrown statue could be interpreted as a capital crime. Informing became a profitable trade, and Rome plunged into an atmosphere of sticky, all-pervading terror. Professional informers, the so-called delatores, who received a portion of the condemned's property, flourished, creating a vicious circle of accusations and executions. Thus, the historian Cremutius Cordus was forced to commit suicide, and his works burned just because in his book he had spoken favorably of Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius. Freedom of speech died. A person could be condemned for changing clothes near a statue of the emperor, or for paying with a coin bearing his image in a brothel. paranoia became the currency of political life. The apogee of this period was the rise of the Praetorian prefect, Lucius alias Sejanus. Sejanus, an ambitious and ruthless upstart from the equestrian order, managed to worm his way into the aging emperor's confidence. He was a master of flattery and intrigue, the antithesis of the straightforward Tiberius. He convinced the emperor, tired of Rome and its political games, to retire to the island of Capri, while he himself remaining in the capital. Effectively became the ruler of the state. One of his key and most far-sighted decisions was to concentrate all Praetorian cohorts, previously scattered throughout Italy, in one huge camp, the Castra Praetoria, right outside the walls of Rome. This move transformed the guard from disparate bodyguards into a monolithic, self-aware political force, the emperor-makers dumbbunds, who would terrorize the city and the Senate for centuries to come. It was Sejanus who unleashed a true terror against the senatorial aristocracy and, most importantly for our story, against the family of the direct heir to the throne, Germanicus. He systematically whispered to Tiberius about conspiracies, about the excessive pride of Germanicus's widow, Agrippina, and about the growing popularity of her sons, who could become a threat to the princeps' power. Such was the world our main character was about to enter. A world where the facade of republican liberties concealed an absolute monarchy, where the power of one man depended not on law but on his personal qualities, where the army was loyal not to the state but to the person of the emperor, and where the air hung with a poisonous fog of paranoia, denunciations, and political assassinations. The system created by the genius of Augustus to maintain peace had turned out to be perfectly adapted for the birth of tyranny. It lacked only one thing, a suitable tyrant, and he was already growing up, far from the gloomy palaces of Rome, in the military camps on the empire's frontier. And while the shadows of intrigue were gathering in Rome and Tiberius was sinking ever deeper into his gloomy isolation, on the cold frontiers of the empire in the lands of Germany, a star was shining, upon which the whole country looked with hope. His name was Nero Claudius Drusus Germanicus, the nephew and adopted son of Tiberius, son of his popular brother Drusus the Elder. Germanicus was everything the ruling emperor was not. He was young, handsome, charming, brave, and fantastically popular. The soldiers adored him. The people saw in him a direct descendant not only of the Claudians but also, through his mother Antonia the Younger, of Mark Antony himself, and his wife, Agrippina the Elder, was the granddaughter of the divine Augustus. The bluest blood of Rome flowed in his veins. He was the living embodiment of the dynastic union of the two great families, the Julii and the Claudii. Germanicus was the personification of Roman valor. He had fought in Pannonia and then led 8 legions on the Rhine, a colossal military force, almost a third of the entire Roman army. He waged arduous campaigns against Germanic tribes, avenging the crushing defeat of Varus in the Teutoburg forest, which had become a national trauma for Rome. He personally visited the site of the tragedy where the bones of the 3 fallen legions still whitened the ground and arranged a burial for the fallen, which was a most powerful symbolic gesture. He crossed the Rhine, invaded deep into hostile lands, burned villages, and fought the Cherusci of Arminius, the very chieftain who had annihilated Varus's legions. He recovered lost eagles, the symbol of a legion's honor, and his name was on everyone's lips. But Germanicus was not only a commander. He was also an exemplary family man, which contrasted sharply with the licentiousness of the Roman elite. His wife, Agrippina the Elder, was a woman to match him, proud, ambitious, fertile, and utterly devoted to her husband. She was the daughter of Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, Augustus's best friend and comrade in arms, and Julia the Elder, the emperor's only daughter. The blood of Augustus flowed in her veins, and she never forgot it. She possessed an indomitable will and believed that her lineage gave her the right to speak and act with a directness unavailable to others. This pride, which so impressed the legionaries, would ultimately become one of the reasons for her demise in the poisonous atmosphere of the Roman court. Against all tradition, she followed him on military campaigns, lived in a tent, not a palace, and shared all the hardships of campaign life with the legionaries. She bore Germanicus 9 children, 6 of whom survived. This was not just a family, it was a living PR project, propaganda of dynastic power, fertility, and stability, a perfect picture for Roman coins and mines. And so, on August 12th of the year 12 of our era, in the resort town of Antium, not far from Rome, a third son was born into this family. He was given the formidable name, Gaius Julius Caesar, a name borne by the dictator and the first emperor. But this name was not destined to stick. When the boy was only 2 or 3, his mother took him with her to a military camp in Germany. To amuse the stern legionaries, she dressed the child in a tiny soldier's uniform, including little boots or caligae. The sight of this toddler clumsily stomping around in military gear sent the battle-hardened veterans into indescribable delight. They nicknamed him Caligula, which literally means little boot. It was a nickname full of soldierly affection, like son of the regiment. This nickname stuck with him for life, and although as emperor he hated it and considered it humiliating, it is by this name that he entered history. There was a deep irony in this nickname. Little boot, a tender, diminutive, almost intimate word, given to him by soldiers out of love, became synonymous with inhuman cruelty and madness. Caligula's childhood was unique. He did not grow up in the marble halls of the Palatine, among fawning courtiers and poisonous intrigues. He grew up in the harsh but honest atmosphere of a military camp. His cradle was the roar of battle trumpets. His toys were the shiny armor of centurions. He was the army's mascot, the son of the legions. Soldiers carried him in their arms, shared their rough food with him, and told him war stories. He saw his father not as a distant aristocrat, but as a leader leading men into battle. He saw his mother not as a noble matron, but as a comrade in arms, capable of stopping a panic and mutiny with her mere appearance. This experience left an indelible mark. Once, when the legions on the Rhine mutinied after Augustus's death, demanding higher pay and early discharge, the situation spiraled out of control. The mutineers were killing centurions and were ready to march on Rome. It was the sight of Agrippina, with little Caligula in her arms, demonstratively leaving the mutinous camp, that shamed the soldiers. The thought that the granddaughter of Augustus and the son of their beloved general were seeking protection among hostile Gauls because of their own betrayal was unbearable. This act of psychological theater stopped the mutiny more effectively than any threats or negotiations. This childhood shaped his character. On the one hand, he was accustomed to adoration and universal attention from an early age. He was the center of a small universe. On the other, he was a witness not only to glory but also to terrible events. He saw blood, death, the cruelty of war. He saw his father mercilessly deal with the instigators of the mutiny. He absorbed from his mother not only pride in his lineage, but also contempt for the senatorial aristocracy, whom his parents considered a collection of cowards and schemers. He saw that real power was not speeches in the Curia, but the loyalty of the legions. But this idyllic, albeit harsh, world was doomed. Germanicus's popularity was too great not to arouse envy and suspicion in Rome, especially from Tiberius. The emperor saw his adopted son not so much as a support but as a potential rival. He recalled Germanicus from the German front, gave him a lavish triumph, and then sent him on an honorable mission to the east, to deal with affairs in the provinces and settle the conflict with Parthia. It was an honorable exile. To keep an eye on the too popular general, Tiberius appointed Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, a harsh, unyielding man personally loyal to the emperor, as governor of Syria. Conflict between Germanicus and Piso was inevitable. They argued over everything: appointments, military plans, protocol. Their wives, Agrippina and Plancina, hated each other and waged open war. And then, in the year 19 of our era, in Antioch, the terrible thing happened. The 33-year-old Germanicus, the hope of Rome, suddenly fell ill. The illness was strange and agonizing. He had a fever, foamed at the mouth, and grew weaker every day. Germanicus himself and his entourage were convinced it was poison. Ominous objects were allegedly found in his chambers. Human remains dug up from graves, spells, lead tablets with his name on them. Before his death, Germanicus begged his friends to avenge him on Piso and Plancina, whom he considered his murderers. Germanicus's death shocked the empire. It was a national grief. Agrippina, with the urn containing her husband's ashes, sailed slowly to Rome. The entire way from Brundisium to the capital, she was accompanied by crowds of weeping people. In Rome itself, the mourning was unprecedented. Business was suspended, temples were closed. People threw stones at idols, cursing the gods who had allowed such an injustice. Little Gaius, who was only 7, walked in this funeral procession. He had not just lost a father, he had lost his world. A world where he was loved, where he was protected. In an instant, he had gone from being the son of the legions to an orphan, a member of a family suspected of conspiracy and hated at court. Piso's trial turned into a political farce. Although he was accused of murder, everyone understood that the real shadow fell on Tiberius. Piso, realizing he would not be saved, committed suicide. But for Germanicus's family, it was just the beginning. The heavenly childhood in military camps was over. Ahead lay what could be called a golden cage, full of mortal dangers. The boy who was once carried in the arms of stern legionaries now found himself in a completely different world. A world where there was no room for the sincerity of a military camp, and the air was saturated with the poison of court intrigues. After Germanicus's death, his family came under attack from the powerful Sejanus. The Praetorian prefect saw Germanicus's sons, Nero and Drusus, as direct competitors on his path to power and systematically turned Tiberius against them. Agrippina, proud and unrestrained in her speech, only added fuel to the fire with her open hostility to the emperor. She did not forgive Tiberius for her husband's death and did not hide it, considering him at least an accessory to the crime. For young Gaius Caligula, years of fear and loss began. He first lived with his great-grandmother Livia, the Dowager Empress, a domineering woman well-versed in politics. She was the matriarch of the dynasty, and as long as she was alive, Sejanus did not dare to launch an open attack. After her death in the year 29, he moved in with his grandmother, Antonia the Younger, a wise and respected woman, the daughter of Mark Antony and Octavia, Augustus's sister. These were years of calm, but the boy saw the ring tightening around his family. He witnessed the tragedy unfold before his eyes. One by one, his older brothers were accused of conspiracy. Nero Caesar, the eldest and most likely heir, was slandered by Sejanus, accused of homosexuality and disrespect for the emperor. He was exiled to the island of Pontia, where he died of starvation. Drusus Caesar, the second brother, was imprisoned in a dungeon on the Palatine where, driven mad, he tried to eat the stuffing of his own mattress and died after 9 days of agony. His mother, the proud Agrippina, was also sent into exile on the island of Pandateria, where, according to rumors, she was beaten until one of her eyes was knocked out and was eventually starved to death. Imagine the psychological state of a teenager who sees his family being methodically and cruelly destroyed by order of the man who is his official guardian and head of state. His mother, His brothers, they all died terrible deaths. Of the once large and happy family, only he and his 3 sisters remained: Agrippina the younger, Julia Drusilla, and Julia Livilla. He lived in constant, blood-curdling fear that he would be next. Every day he awaited the arrival of a centurion with an order for his arrest or execution. Every rustle behind the door could mean the end. This experience permanently scarred his soul. He learned to hide his true feelings behind an impenetrable mask. He understood that any emotion, any careless word could become a death sentence. Survival became his only goal. He mastered the art of mimicry to perfection, turning his face into an indifferent mask. And then in the year 31 of our era, when he was 19, the fateful summons came. Tiberius, ruling the empire from his rocky seclusion on the island of Capri, called him to his side. It was like walking into the lion's den. Caligula went to Capri, not knowing whether belated recognition as heir or a quick and quiet death awaited him there. The island of Capri under Tiberius was a place from nightmares. It was a fortress of paranoia. The old emperor, now in his 70s, surrounded himself with astrologers, like the famous Thrasyllus, informers, and executioners. The historian Suetonius, who did not spare dark colors, describes Capri as a theater of perverse cruelty and debauchery. Tiberius allegedly staged monstrous orgies with children of both sexes, the so-called spintriae, and those who bored him or aroused his suspicion were mercilessly thrown from a cliff into the sea, where specially trained sailors finished them off with clubs below. How true these stories are, we do not know. They are probably greatly exaggerated by hostile senatorial propaganda. But the atmosphere of total suspicion and the absolute unrestrained power of the old tyrant was undeniable. It was in this atmosphere that Caligula spent 6 years of his youth. For 6 years he lived side by side with the man he considered his family's murderer, and he played his role brilliantly. Ancient authors unanimously note his incredible ability to feign. He demonstrated absolute obedience, guessed Tiberius's slightest wishes, laughed at his jokes, and never spoke of his deceased mother and brothers. He became the emperor's shadow. Tacitus wrote that Caligula secured his life at the cost of slavish submission. He wore a mask for so long that perhaps he himself no longer remembered the face beneath it. But behind this mask of a fawning youth lay a boiling lava of hatred, fear, and suppressed desires. At night, it is said, he would put on a wig and beard and indulge in the wildest amusements, as if trying to release the accumulated demon. He watched with morbid curiosity the tortures and executions that Tiberius arranged for his entertainment. He was fascinated by the very mechanics of power and violence. He studied his jailer, absorbing his methods, his cruelty, his contempt for people. It was on Capri, many believe, that the future monster was formed. Tiberius, who was a shrewd psychologist, saw this duality. According to legend, he once said of him, "I am nursing a viper for the Roman people and a phaethon for the whole world," comparing him simultaneously to a poisonous snake and to the mythical youth who, having taken the chariot of his father the sun, nearly burned the whole earth. It was here, on Capri, that he witnessed the fall of the all-powerful Sejanus. Tiberius, having received proof of a conspiracy, played a brilliant and cruel combination. He sent his man, Macro, to Rome with a secret letter for the Senate. While Sejanus sat in the Curia awaiting new honors, the consul read a long, confusing message from the emperor. Only at the very end came the order for his arrest. The stunned Sejanus was immediately seized, and on the same day, the Senate sentenced him to death. His body was thrown onto the Gemonian stairs, and the mob tore his remains for several days. Caligula saw how quickly the most powerful man in the state could fall. He learned the main lesson of tyranny. Either you kill or you are killed. During these years, Caligula found a powerful ally, the new Praetorian prefect Quintus Naevius Sutorius Macro. Macro was the man who had helped Tiberius overthrow Sejanus, and now he occupied his place. A pragmatist, Macro understood that Tiberius was old and would soon die, and the only real heir was Caligula, along with Tiberius's grandson Gemellus, but he was still a child. He began to secretly patronize the young man, preparing him for his accession to power. According to rumors, he even convinced his wife, Ennia, to become Caligula's lover to bind him even more tightly. Thus, in this nest of vipers balancing on a knife's edge, Caligula waited for his moment. He had learned to hate and to wait, and then on March 16th of the year 37, that moment came. News of the 78-year-old Tiberius's death spread through the empire like wildfire. The circumstances of his demise are still a matter of debate. According to one version, he died a natural death. According to another, more dramatic and popular version, he fell into a coma, and when everyone thought he was dead and began to hail Caligula as the new emperor, the old man suddenly revived and asked for food. In the ensuing panic, Macro allegedly ordered Tiberius to be smothered with his own pillows, while Caligula watched in horror. Whether this was true or another grim legend no longer mattered. For Rome and for the entire empire, Tiberius's death was a liberation. The 23 years of his reign, especially the last years, were perceived as an era of darkness, fear, and sorrow. And now, to replace this gloomy past, came he, the young, handsome 24-year-old Gaius, son of the adored Germanicus. His journey from Capri to Rome became a continuous triumph. People ran out onto the roads to greet him. Cities held festivals in his honor. He was called our baby, our star, our little pigeon. They saw in him not just a new ruler, but a savior who would bring back the golden age to Rome. All the accumulated love for his father Germanicus now transferred to him. When he entered Rome, he was met by such jubilant crowds as the city had not seen since the triumphs of his ancestors. For 3 months, it was said, more than 160,000 animals were sacrificed in gratitude to the gods for the new emperor. And in the first months of his reign, Caligula seemed to justify all the hopes placed in him. He acted as an ideal ruler, as if he had stepped out of the pages of philosophical treatises. His first steps were flawless and elicited universal delight. Firstly, he showed a filial piety that touched the hearts of the Romans. He personally went to the islands of Panditaria and Pontia, where his mother and brother had perished, collected their remains, and with the greatest honors, transported them to Rome to be interred in the mausoleum of Augustus. He declared his mother's birthday an official holiday. He paid out all the bequests left by Tiberius and Livia, which the former had not had time or inclination to fulfill, and even added generous bonuses of his own. He distributed 300 sesterces to every citizen of Rome, a huge sum for the time. He gave the Praetorians double pay, understanding to whom he truly owed the throne. Secondly, he made a series of brilliant political moves aimed at liberalizing the regime. He declared a full amnesty for all who had been condemned or exiled under Tiberius. He publicly, in the Forum, burned all the archives of informers and the records of the trials concerning his mother and brothers, swearing he had not even read them, though many suspected he burned copies and kept the originals. He abolished the hated law of majestas, declaring that in his state, no one would have to fear for their words. He allowed the circulation of the works of historians like Titus Labienus and Cremutius Cordus, which had been banned under Tiberius for their republican sympathies. Moreover, for the first time in a long while, he published the state budget, showing the revenues and expenditures of the treasury, a gesture of unheard-of transparency after the secretive Tiberius. He returned to the Senate and the people the right to elect magistrates which Tiberius had effectively usurped, restoring the appearance of republican procedure. Thirdly, he launched a large-scale program of public entertainment and construction. Understanding that the Roman plebs demanded bread and circuses, he staged grandiose gladiatorial games, theatrical performances, and chariot races. He completed the Temple of Augustus and the Theater of Pompey, begun by Tiberius. He started two colossal projects that would be completed after his death, the Aqua Claudia and the Anio Novus aqueducts, which would supply Rome with clean water for centuries. He also expanded the harbor at Rhegium to cope with the growing grain supplies and to prevent the threat of famine in the capital. It seemed a real thaw had begun. The Senate was euphoric. They bestowed upon him all possible honors, including the title Father of the Fatherland. Caligula was everywhere. He gave speeches, personally participated in extinguishing a fire, and conversed with common people. He was the complete opposite of his gloomy predecessor. A special place in his heart, it seemed, was reserved for his sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla, and Livilla. He granted them unprecedented honors, the rights and privileges of Vestal virgins, and a place beside him at the games. The official oath of allegiance to the emperor was amended to include the phrase, "And I will not hold my life and the lives of my children dearer than the life of Gaius and his sisters." This was unheard of. Roman politics had always been a man's world. Now, the women of his family were coming to the forefront, a feature more characteristic of the Hellenistic monarchies of Egypt or Syria. He particularly favored his middle sister, Drusilla. He treated her with such tenderness and love that even then, the first sinister rumors of their incestuous relationship began to circulate. It was said that he took her from her husband, Lucius Cassius Longinus, and lived with her openly as with a legal wife. For them, survivors of the hell of court intrigues, this bond may have been not so much a perverse passion as a desperate attempt to cling to the only island of safety and trust in a world full of betrayal. But during that honeymoon period, which lasted about 7 or 8 months, people tried to ignore these rumors. Rome was happy. It seemed the nightmare of Tiberius's tyranny had passed forever. The empire had a young, energetic, generous, and just ruler. No one, absolutely no one, could have imagined that this bright, dazzling dawn was merely a prelude to an impenetrable night of terror. The sun that had risen over Rome was too bright not to burn everything around it, and the first blow of fate was already very near. In the autumn of the year 37, at the peak of his popularity, Caligula suddenly fell gravely ill. What this illness was remains a mystery to this day. Ancient sources describe it very sparsely, speaking only of a severe fever. Modern researchers propose numerous hypotheses. From viral encephalitis or meningitis, which could have damaged the brain and caused irreversible personality changes, to temporal lobe epilepsy, which is known to cause hallucinations, fits of rage, and religious mania. Some suggest the presence of a brain tumor. Others have developed a theory of a hereditary mental disorder in the Julio-Claudian family, and some believe it was not a physical but a purely psychological breakdown. The colossal stress associated with years of fear under Tiberius, the burden of absolute power suddenly thrust upon him, and the weight of responsibility for the fate of the world simply broke his psyche. But whatever the nature of this illness, its consequences for the empire were catastrophic. News of the emperor's ailment plunged Rome into despair. People crowded day and night at the palace, awaiting news. The city froze in anxious silence. Many made vows to the gods, offering their own lives in exchange for the life of the princeps. One man even swore to fight in the arena as a gladiator if Caligula recovered. Another wrote on a tablet that he was ready to die. This nationwide love, it seemed, should have softened the heart of any ruler. and he did recover. But he emerged from the illness a completely different man. It was as if the fever had burned away everything human in his soul, leaving only ashes and a monstrous void, which he began to fill with his boundless will. The mask of the ideal ruler cracked and crumbled, revealing a face that plunged Rome into terror. It was reported that he began to suffer from severe insomnia, able to sleep no more than 3 hours, and spent the rest of the night wandering through the palace, crying out for the dawn. He would stand for hours before a mirror, rehearsing terrifying grimaces, trying to give his face the most ferocious expression. This was not just vanity, it was a process of conscious dehumanization, of transforming himself from a man into an idol, a living symbol of terror and power. The first to feel this were those closest to him, those who had brought him to power. The first victim was his cousin and co-heir by Tiberius's will, the young Tiberius Gemellus. Caligula had adopted him at the beginning of his reign, but now, after his illness, he saw him as a threat. Under the pretext that Gemellus was supposedly feigning a cough to avoid drinking medicine that could have protected him from Caligula's poison, the emperor accused him of conspiracy and ordered him to commit suicide. The tribune sent to carry out the order found the youth in tears. He had never seen a sword in his life and did not know how to kill himself with it. The soldier had to show him where to strike. The next victim was his father-in-law, Marcus Junius Silanus, a respected senator, the father of his first deceased wife. His crime was that he had refused to accompany the emperor on a sea voyage during a storm, citing seasickness. Caligula interpreted this as a desire to remain in Rome and seize power in case of his death. He too was forced to commit suicide. Then came the turn of the man to whom Caligula owed everything, the Praetorian prefect Macro, the very same Macro who had saved him on Capri and placed him on the throne. But now his influence and knowledge of past secrets had become burdensome for the new Caligula. The emperor accused Macro and his wife Ennia of numerous crimes and forced them both to commit suicide. The man who had taught him the art of survival had himself fallen victim to his pupil. In a few months, Caligula had destroyed his entire inner circle. He got rid of everyone who had known him before he became a god. He cut all ties with the past. These were no longer political moves, but the actions of a paranoid who sees enemies in everyone who might question his greatness. The apotheosis of this transformation was his reaction to the death of his beloved sister Drusilla in the year 38. He fell into a state bordering on madness. He let his beard and hair grow, wandered for months through Italy, uttering insane cries. He declared a universal mourning throughout the empire, a justitium, during which it was forbidden to laugh, bathe, or even dine with family. Any violation was punishable by death. One man was executed for selling hot water. But this was not enough for him. He did something unprecedented. He forced the Senate to officially deify Drusilla, granting her the title Divine Panthea, or All-Goddess. A temple was erected in her honor, and a priestly cult was appointed. This was not just an expression of grief. It was a turning point. He had not just lost a sister, he had lost his last anchor, his connection to humanity, the only bright image from his past. Now nothing held back the darkness within him. If his sister was a goddess, then who was he, her brother and, as rumors claimed, her lover? The answer was self-evident. From this moment on, Caligula ceased to play the first among equals. He began to seriously consider himself a god, and he would force Rome to believe it, or die. The Golden Age had ended before it had even begun. The era of divine terror was dawning. What followed Caligula's illness and Drusilla's death was like a bad dream, a nightmare that had become reality for the entire Roman Empire. His reign turned into a grandiose and bloody spectacle where the sole director, actor, and audience was the emperor himself. His actions, described by Suetonius and Cassius Dio, seem so absurd and monstrous that many historians still debate whether this was the result of clinical madness or a cold, calculated policy to establish an absolute monarchy of the Eastern Hellenistic type. It was probably both. Caligula was no longer content with the role of a man. He declared himself a living god. At first, he began to appear in public in the guises of various deities, with Neptune's trident, with Jupiter's thunderbolts, in Mars's armor, or even in the female attire of Venus. He ordered the famous statue of Olympian Zeus by Phidias, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, to be brought from Greece in order to cut off its head and replace it with his own likeness. Fortunately, according to legend, the ship sent for the statue was struck by lightning, and the statue itself burst into such thunderous laughter that the workers fled in terror. He extended his palace on the Palatine, connecting it with the special bridge to the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, so that, as he said, he could communicate directly with his brother Jupiter. He often held loud conversations with the god, sometimes whispering something in his ear, sometimes threatening him if he sent bad weather during his games. At night, it was rumored, he would summon the moon for a conversation, demanding that she come down to his bed. He built his own temple in his own honor, where the most noble senators served as priests forced to buy this humiliating position for huge sums of money. Flamingos, peacocks, and other exotic birds were sacrificed to his new deity, but his most dangerous venture in this area was the attempt to install his own giant statue in the most sacred place for the Jews, the temple in Jerusalem. For the Jews, with their strict monotheism, this was an unimaginable blasphemy, a sacrilege they were prepared to prevent at the cost of their lives. The governor of Syria, Praetorians, who received this order, found himself in a terrible position. He understood that its execution would lead to a colossal rebellion that would engulf the entire East. He delayed the making of the statue in every possible way, writing letters to Caligula, trying to dissuade him. Tens of thousands of Jews went out into the fields and declared they would rather have their throats cut than allow such desecration. A delegation of Jewish Jews, led by the philosopher Philo of Alexandria, traveled to Rome to beg the emperor to rescind the order. Philo's description of their audience is a most vivid portrait of a mad tyrant. Caligula received them not in the throne room, but forced them to run after him through gardens and villas while he gave orders to workers, inspected buildings, and went about his business. He did not listen to their pleas, but intermittently asked mocking questions. "So you are the blasphemers who don't eat pork. Why? Is it not tasty?" Then he would suddenly run off to another room, forcing the elderly sages to follow him. In the end, he threw over his shoulder, "These people, in my opinion, are not so much villains as unfortunate fools if they do not believe in my divine nature." Only Caligula's sudden death saved Judea from a bloodbath and the entire empire from a catastrophic war. Divine status and grandiose projects required colossal sums of money. The generous handouts at the beginning of his reign and the insane spending on feasts, games, and construction quickly emptied the treasury of 2,700,000,000 sesterces that Tiberius had left full. Caligula began to raise funds with the ingenuity of a maniac. He revived the trials for Augustus, but now their purpose was the confiscation of the condemned's property. Wealthy senators were accused on the slightest pretext and executed, and their fortunes passed to the treasury. He introduced a system of forced wills. Noblemen were obliged to include the emperor in their wills, and if they continued to live too long after that, they could be accused of disrespect and killed. He introduced new, absurd taxes, a tax on lawsuits, a tax on the services of porters, a tax on food sold in taverns. The height of cynicism was the opening of a state brothel right in the imperial palace. The wives and daughters of senators and equestrians were forcibly taken there, and special heralds called for clients in the forum. All proceeds went personally to the emperor. He held sham auctions where he forced senators to buy old gladiatorial equipment at exorbitant prices, watching their humiliation and making them compete in bidding. His most famous and senseless project was the pontoon bridge across the Bay of Baiae near Naples. He ordered merchant ships to be gathered from all over the empire, arranged them in 2 rows for nearly 5 kilometers, laid planks on top, and covered them with earth. The result was a floating bridge. Then Caligula, dressed in the armor of Alexander the Great, galloped on his favorite horse across this bridge and back, and the next day held a grand drinking party on it. The purpose of this action? According to one version, he wanted to disprove the prediction of the astrologer Thrasyllus, who had said that Gaius had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Bay of Baiae. According to another, more plausible version, he wanted to surpass the Persian king Xerxes, who had once built a bridge across the Hellespont. It was a demonstration of absolute divine power over nature itself. Power had corrupted him absolutely. He reveled not only in luxury but also in the fear he inspired in those around him. His famous phrase, which he often repeated, was "Oderint, dumetuant," which means, "Let them hate so long as they fear." Once he uttered an even more terrible wish. Would that the Roman people had but one neck. He forced senators, dressed in togas, to run for several miles behind his chariot. He could, during a feast, suddenly burst into laughter, and when asked what so amused him, he would reply, "I was just thinking that if I were to but nod, both your heads would be cut off." He would order people to be executed and then a few days later send for them, as if having forgotten his order. When told these people were already dead, he would reply indifferently, "Oh yes, I remember." He forced fathers to attend the executions of their sons, and afterward invited them to a feast and made them joke and be merry. Any display of grief meant a death sentence. He executed people on the slightest whim. A zookeeper who made a mistake he ordered to be slowly sawn in half. A man who had sworn to become a gladiator in exchange for his health, he forced to fulfill his vow and only let him go after he had won several fights. He complained that there had been no major disasters during his reign, like a defeat of the legions or an epidemic, that could have made his era memorable. During the games, if he disliked a performance, he could order the guards to drive entire sections of spectators into the arena and throw them to wild beasts, having first torn out their tongues so they could not scream. His cruelty was inextricably linked with a dark, twisted humor. He could invite a man to a feast while having his son executed in the next room. He could kiss his wife or mistress on the neck and whisper, "This lovely neck will be cut as soon as I command it." The pinnacle of his contempt for Roman state institutions was the story of his favorite horse, Incitatus, or Swiftfoot. He built for it a marble stable with an ivory manger, purple blankets, and jeweled necklaces. The horse had its own slaves and even a palace where it received guests on behalf of the emperor. On the eve of races, he would post soldiers to ensure complete silence in the neighborhood so as not to disturb his favorite's sleep. Suetonius claims that Caligula seriously intended to appoint Incitatus as consul, the highest official of the Roman Republic. Before making him consul, he had already appointed him as high priest of his own cult, which was another act of mockery against religion and the senatorial class. Most likely it was no more than a vicious joke, a demonstration that his horse was worth more than all the senators combined. But this joke perfectly illustrated the abyss of absurdity into which Rome had plunged. Even his military campaigns he turned into a farce. In the year 39, he went to Germany supposedly to suppress a conspiracy by the governor Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Gaetulicus. Instead of real battles, he staged mock fights, ordering his German bodyguards to hide in the forest and then suddenly attack them. The height of absurdity was his famous British campaign. He brought the legions to the shore of the English Channel, drew them up in battle formations, deployed ballistae and catapults, ordered the trumpets to sound, and then ordered the soldiers to collect seashells on the beach. These seashells he called spoils taken from the ocean and sent them to Rome as proof of his great victory. Historians still debate what this was: a punishment for mutinous legions, a symbolic act of conquering nature, or just another manifestation of madness. Thus it went on for almost 4 years. 4 years of fear, humiliation, unpredictable cruelty, and divine absurdity. Rome held its breath. The senators, trembling for their lives, paid him divine honors. The people, bribed with spectacles, remained silent. But the elite's patience was at an end. In the shadows of the palace corridors, in the barracks of the Praetorians, an understanding was already maturing. The god who lived on the Palatine was not immortal, and he needed to be sent to the underworld, to his dead ancestors, before he dragged all of Rome down with him. A man who claims to be a god soon discovers that even gods can bleed. The atmosphere in Rome by the beginning of the year 41 had become unbearable. Fear had turned into desperation, and desperation into resolve. The conspiracy against Caligula was not a spontaneous outburst of anger. It was a carefully prepared act in which a multitude of motives were intertwined. Personal revenge, fear for one's own life, and perhaps for a small group of idealists, the hope of restoring the Republic. At the center of the conspiracy were the men who, by duty, were closest to the emperor, the officers of the Praetorian Guard. The main driving force and executor was the tribune Cassius Chaerea. He was an elderly, experienced soldier, a veteran of Germanicus's German campaigns. But Caligula had found a special form of humiliation for him. Chaerea had a thin, high-pitched voice, and the emperor constantly mocked him, calling him by women's names, giving him feminine passwords like Venus or Priapus, and upon meeting him, extending his hand for a kiss in an indecent manner. For a proud Roman soldier, this was worse than torture. For a Roman of his standing, the concept of dignitas, that is, dignity, honor, and social status, was dearer than life. Caligula was not just insulting Chaerea, he was systematically destroying his identity in the eyes of society. Murder became for Chaerea the only way to restore his violated honor. He was joined by another tribune, Cornelius Sabinus. His motives were simpler. He was afraid. He saw how the emperor executed people on the slightest suspicion and understood that sooner or later, his turn would come. But the conspiracy was not limited to the Praetorians. Influential senators such as Annius Venetianus were also involved, their motives being more political. They risked everything but understood that Caligula's continued rule was leading to the complete destruction of their class and the plunder of their property. Some freedmen of the imperial court who had access to his chambers were also involved, for example, Callistus, who feared for his position in life. It was a broad coalition of desperate people united by a common hatred. The conspirators tried to carry out their plans several times, but something always interfered. They wanted to kill him during a trip to Alexandria, but the trip was canceled. They planned to attack him during a theatrical performance, but Caligula sat in a box surrounded by his loyal German bodyguards, huge and fierce warriors personally devoted to him. Finally, they chose the perfect moment, the last day of the Palatine Games, January 24th of the year 41. The games were held in a theater located next to the palace. The plan was simple: to intercept the emperor as he went from the theater to the palace for lunch. His path lay through the very cryptoporticus, a narrow, dark underground corridor where there was little space and where his bodyguards could not effectively protect him. The day was filled with ominous portents. which historians later delighted in listing. The night before, Caligula dreamed that he was standing before Jupiter's throne, and Jupiter kicked him from the heavens down to earth. On the day of the murder, a flamingo was sacrificed, and the bird's blood spattered the emperor's own toga. During the games, a play called Cinyras was performed, the finale of which depicted a bloody murder, and the stage was drenched in artificial blood. All this created an oppressive atmosphere. Caligula, as luck would have it, was in no hurry. He decided not to go to lunch but to stay and watch a performance by young aristocrats from Asia who were to sing and dance in his honor. The conspirators were in a panic. Any delay could lead to failure and exposure. Then his uncle Claudius and other close associates began to persuade him to go and rest, citing the midday heat. Finally, he reluctantly agreed. He stood up and headed for the exit. The main body of his retinue took a long roundabout path. Caligula, however, accompanied by only a few senators and those same young dancers with whom he wanted to speak, chose the short path through the cryptoporticus. This was the chance the conspirators had been waiting for. When the group entered the gloom of the corridor, their attackers were already waiting for them. Chaerea approached with the question about the password. Caligula's insulting joke followed, then Chaerea's cry, "Do it now!" and the first sword blow. The emperor fell but was still alive. He cried out, trying to get up. At that moment, the others fell upon him. 30 blows. They stabbed him in the chest, the stomach, the face, the groin. It was not an execution. It was a butchery, an act of frenzied hatred. When it was over, the murderers, realizing what they had done, fled in panic. But the bloodshed did not end there. While chaos reigned in the palace and the emperor's body lay in the corridor, several conspirators burst into the chambers of his wife, Melonia Caesonia. They found her weeping over the body of their little daughter, Julia Drusilla. A centurion killed Caesonia with a sword blow, and the little girl, no more than 2 years old, was grabbed by the legs and her head was smashed against a wall. Suetonius writes that the girl already showed her father's cruelty, trying to scratch the faces and gouge out the eyes of her playmates. This is probably a fabrication, but it shows how obsessed the conspirators were with the idea of destroying the seed of the tyrant to the root, leaving no one who could claim the throne or become a symbol for revenge. Rome plunged into lawlessness. Hearing the noise, Caligula's loyal German bodyguards rushed into the palace. Not finding the murderers, they, in a rage, began to kill everyone who crossed their path. Innocent senators, servants, spectators. Panic began in the streets. The Senate, having gathered on the Capitoline Hill, began to feverishly discuss the future. The boldest orators called for the restoration of the Republic and the complete oblivion of the tyranny. They even managed to pass a decree for a damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory, ordering the destruction of all of Caligula's statues and the erasure of his name from all monuments. It seemed that the 4-year nightmare had come to an end and Rome would return to the old republican ideals, but they had forgotten about one force that had long decided the fate of Rome: the Praetorian Guard. And while the senators were making speeches, one of the Praetorians, a soldier named Gratus, searching the deserted palace for loot, looked behind a curtain and saw a figure trembling with fear. It was Claudius, Caligula's 50-year-old uncle, whom everyone considered a harmless eccentric and a bumbling scholar. The soldier, instead of killing him, pulled him out and, to Claudius's own astonishment, hailed him as the new emperor. Thus, in chaos and blood, by chance, behind a curtain, the fate of the empire was decided. The Julio-Claudian era continued. The tyrant was dead. His wife and daughter were murdered. But the ghost of Caligula, that mad god in soldier's boots, would long haunt Rome, leaving an indelible scar on the body of the empire and in the historical memory of mankind. The first act of the new Emperor Claudius, confirmed by the Praetorians against the will of the Senate, was to cancel the condemnation of memory. He did this not out of love for his nephew, but out of pragmatism. If one emperor could be murdered with impunity and his name erased, the same could be done to another. Caligula's body was secretly cremated and buried. Claudius executed his murderers, including Cassius Chaerea, not for killing a tyrant, but for violating their military oath. It was a clear signal. The emperor's power was sacred, even if that emperor was a monster. But it was impossible to erase the memory of Caligula. His short but dazzlingly horrific reign became a profound trauma and a crucial lesson for Rome. It ruthlessly exposed the fragility of the Principate system created by Augustus. It turned out that the well-being of hundreds of millions of people, the stability of a gigantic empire, depended solely on the personal qualities, on the mental health of a single individual. The system had no mechanisms to protect against a madman on the throne. And this is what gives rise to the main question that historians still ask today. Was Caligula truly insane? The traditional version, coming from ancient authors, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, Seneca, Philo of Alexandria, is unequivocal. Yes, he was. They paint a portrait of a mad sadist whose actions lack all logic. However, these sources should be treated with great caution. All of them belonged to the senatorial elite, or were closely associated with it. They wrote their works after Caligula's death, during the reigns of other dynasties, and had every reason to blacken his memory. For them, Caligula was the perfect embodiment of a bad emperor, against whose background their own patrons looked like saviors of the fatherland. Seneca, for example, had been exiled by Caligula and bore a personal hatred for him. Suetonius wrote almost a century later and loved to collect scandalous anecdotes. In the 20th and 21st centuries, another point of view has emerged, the so-called revisionist one. According to it, Caligula was not insane in the clinical sense of the word. He was a radical, ruthless, and absolutely logical in his cruelty reformer. He saw the hypocrisy of Augustus's system, where the emperor pretended to be a simple citizen and the Senate a ruling body. And he decided to cast aside these fictions. His goal was to create an open, absolute monarchy of the Hellenistic Eastern type, where the ruler is a living god and all others are his slaves. From this perspective, his mad actions acquire a sinister logic. The deification of himself and his sister was not mania, but a political tool for the sacralization of power, imported from Ptolemaic Egypt. The humiliation of the senators, the story of the horse-consul, these were not absurdities, but a deliberate policy to destroy the old aristocracy as a political class, a demonstration of their complete worthlessness. The bridge at Baiae was not a whim, but a demonstration of divine omnipotence, surpassing the deeds of legendary kings. Even the collection of seashells on the shore of the channel can be interpreted as a symbolic conquest of the ocean, which places him on a par with gods and the greatest conquerors of the past. He was not mad. He was a revolutionary who tried to remake Rome by force and terror. And he lost because the Roman elite was not yet ready for such a sharp break with tradition. Where is the truth? Probably, as is often the case, somewhere in between. Most likely, his personality was a tragic blend of real mental problems aggravated by illness and childhood traumas and cold political calculation. He was simultaneously a sick man and a cruel politician. He was a product of his era, a boy raised among soldiers who saw the death of his entire family, taught the art of survival by the most brutal tyrant, and who suddenly received unlimited power over the world. Such a burden is capable of breaking even the strongest man. But for world culture, Caligula has forever remained not a politician, but an archetype. He became the eternal symbol of absolute power that corrupts absolutely. His name became a byword for a mad, capricious, and cruel tyrant. He is the main character of countless plays, novels, operas, and films, from Albert Camus' Caligula, where he is presented as an existential philosopher, to Tinto Brass's scandalous film. His story is an eternal warning, a warning about how thin the line is between man and beast, between a ruler and a despot, between order and chaos. The story of Caligula is not just the story of one monster. It is a mirror that reflects the very nature of power. He was not an anomaly. He was a logical, albeit absurdly extreme consequence of a system where the will of one man became higher than any law. He was the fever that revealed the deep sickness already lurking in the political body of Rome. The story of Caligula teaches us that power, not limited by law, conscience, and compassion, inevitably leads to catastrophe. It shows how easily a crowd can turn its love into hatred. And perhaps most terrifyingly, it demonstrates that to create a monster, an army of demons is not always needed. Sometimes a single broken boy given power over the whole world is enough. And it reminds us that even the most powerful god on earth can be brought down by a simple piece of sharpened metal in the hand of a desperate man in a dark corridor beneath the glitter and tinsel of a great empire. The ghost of Little Boot still wanders through the pages of history, reminding us of the dark depths of the human soul and the fragility of civilization.